Something I find fascinating in the realms of video games and movies is the popular assumption from content creators that audiences want ever-increasing realism. In both of these commercial art forms, there's an ongoing pursuit of increasingly photorealistic visual content, and an increasing rejection of any story or character cliches that might be deemed childish or cheesy. Old school cliches are often frowned upon, and game and movie makers are on the whole tending more and more towards creating content that is dark and realistic. And in video games, the word immersive is frequently used to describe game content as realistic. Once a particular new cliché of realism is firmly established, such as more fluid character animation in video games or the addition of depth of field in CGI movie effects, most new movies and games that do not conform to those new clichés are heavily criticized, as if those new clichés are the things that really matter most. But as I've read and listened over the years to much of the debates, reviews and critique of new movies and games, I've frequently noticed that the prevailing fads of expected realism are often accompanied by the silent acceptance of features that are simply ludicrous. An example that does sometimes get talked about is that despite all the advances of combat realism in first-person shooter war games, players now usually have regenerating health bars. You get shot, and you can simply hide in a corner and your wounds will heal within seconds. It used to be that in most games when you took a hit, your health bar was permanently reduced until you found a health kit or some sort of superfood to replenish it. So in that case, the current fad is away from realism. Another example, which I don't hear talked about very much, but must be obvious to many people anyway, is that tons of superhero movies are getting released that are described by the filmmakers and film reviewers as dark and realistic. But superheroes by their nature are unrealistic. No matter how much you dress it up, a guy in a cape who can fly without the aid of wings or aviation is the stuff of children's fantasies. If realism is what people want, then why didn't they take away the Man of Steel's ability to fly? Okay, so that's a couple of obvious contradictions regarding the pursuit of realism in games and movies. Now what I'm going to do in the rest of this video is break down the detailed aesthetics of movies and games into a few different categories. And in each case I'm going to explore whether realism can be achieved and whether realism seems to be what audiences and gamers generally want. Now the full version of this study, which is in text form on my website, is 15 chapters long. But what I'm going to do in this video is just select about 4 chapters from that study, and if anybody wants to know more, they can just go and read the full article on my website. The link is in the video description below. With both movies and games, the vast majority of instances will involve the audience experiencing the content through a rectangular screen, with 1 or 2 speakers positioned near that screen. Big screens tend to be popular, though a small screen on a mobile phone can sometimes fill as much of your field of vision if you bring it close to your face. Though there generally isn't as much detail as there is with a large screen. These screens are almost always wider than they are high, and I believe the main reasons for this are A, because we have 2 eyes placed side by side, thus giving us a slightly wider horizontal scope of vision in the real world, in combination with our eyebrows blocking out part of our vertical vision. And B, because wider screens allow us to show in detail more than one person from the waist up. This is important because most of our non-verbal communication is carried out in facial expressions and hand gestures. A movie screen that is taller than it is wide would inevitably result in our attention constantly being drawn to the upper half of the image where people's faces and hands are to be found. Perhaps one day we'll have some sort of viewing screens that change dimension according to the requirements of changing content within a movie, just like we vary the framing of photos. But for now we're stuck with dimensions that are absolutely restricted for individual games and movies. Various attempts have been made to break game and movie formats out of the rectangular box visual limitation. We've had virtual reality helmets, curved cinerama screens, and giant screens so large that they extend closer to or sometimes beyond our peripheral vision. There are even some instances of PC users fitting 3 monitors next to each other to create panoramic visuals in certain games. But none of these more realistic formats have yet caught on for the general public, possibly due to hardware expense. Instead, their predominant use is for simulation training for soldiers, pilots, and so on. Now, assuming we could have full panoramic visuals, it's fairly obvious that this would be a big attraction for gamers. Being attacked by off-screen enemies can be annoying, so having a wider range of vision plus the ability to quickly tilt your actual head to see something would allow greater interactivity. However, with movies, panoramic vision would be almost completely impractical. The narrative content of a movie requires that the filmmakers restrict our viewpoint to draw our attention to particular people, objects and events at specific points in the story. And filmmakers have this unique little aesthetic tool called editing. They can chop and change our viewpoints at will to show us anything from any angle in relation to the story. Create a panoramic view and suddenly the viewer might find themselves choosing to look 90 degrees to their right to see a sunset, rather than looking at two characters who are sharing an important moment in the story directly in front of them. Not to mention it would be a nightmare for filmmakers to actually get movies made, because the panoramic viewpoint would reveal their crew and filming equipment, thus utterly revealing the illusion of realism in the story. So restricted viewpoints are an essential requirement of movies. When it comes to sound, we're equally restricted, but in a less obvious way. In the real world we can detect whether sounds come from any of dozens of directions and distances, but movies and games restrict us to either a single speaker, or usually to a two-speaker system, or occasionally 5 speakers, but again mostly positioned in front of us. Being that the visual content is all displayed in a box in front of us, it's not so jarring to have all the sound come from that direction too. However, we do tend to enjoy surround sound when we can get it, which is usually in a movie theatre, but there's also an argument against realism here too. Many movies will show characters talking in busy, noisy environments. If we had full surround sound, then those characters' voices could be drowned out by the thousands of noises coming from other directions. In games though, it's a little more practical because there's generally not much going on in game environments that is not related to gameplay. Although as game environments get more complex, this could change. And dialogue is also less important generally in games compared to movies. Okay, so we've looked a little at sight and sound interface, but beyond that there's generally no other interface content in movies. Our physical bodies are almost entirely unaffected by movies apart from restricting our eyes, level of visual focus, and head positions toward a particular point in space. Though our emotional reactions to movies might trigger some small chemical changes in our bloodstream, or even trigger a tear or two or increased heart rate. But do we want movies to extend any further beyond their current visual and audio limitations?
This is the best 3D I've ever seen.
I've seen better.
In the open mass grave scene from Apocalypto, do we want to smell the hundreds of rotting corpses and risk throwing up on our sofas? While watching The Thing, do we want to physically feel the Antarctic temperatures of the film's setting and risk frostbite? And how about the drowning scene from The Abyss? Do we want our breathing to be restricted when our viewpoint goes underwater? Not only are these kinds of unpleasant sensations near technically impossible to impose on the audience, they're also impractical because they would damage the audience's health.
This is it, Jennifer. Your big break in TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch.
Of course, we'd no doubt be more receptive to positive physical stimulation from movies such as the smell of good food, the high of a drug, or the ecstasy of sex, but again there's a massive gap in technology. All of this also applies in computer games. Gamers don't want to feel the intense pain of a sword slice, a bullet impact, or a jaw-breaking punch. And if they did feel those things, then they might suffer a heart attack or psychological trauma. There have been assorted attempts to bring some physicality to games such as arcade machines that rock, light guns, vibrating joypads or motion trackers, but it's nothing like reality. The light guns lack the weight, hard recoil, heat and smoke of real guns, and if they had those features they'd actually be physically dangerous to the gamer.
Here we go.
Generally, such features are merely to give a very watered down and entirely safety conscious bit of physical stimulation to the player, but more often they serve the purpose of giving the player a more varied range of ways to control their character in a game. Most gaming is still limited to the sole physical activity of pressing buttons on a joypad or keyboard, or moving a mouse about with just one hand. I've not even come across a game yet that involves two mouses. So the interface system hasn't changed much since the old days of the Atari 2600. We just have more buttons and more sensitive control sticks. It seems that gamers are happy with this entirely unrealistic interface. Playing a shooter in which you actually have to run on a treadmill to move around, or actually fall to the ground and crawl, would be great for keeping in shape, but most gamers would get tired and opt for the comfort of their trusty joypad. And the last point I'll add is that movies are definitely not designed for interaction. They're simply stories that we observe and are unable to partake in. This in itself is a definitive separation with reality. In reality, each of us is restricted from the day we're born to the day we die to a single viewpoint. Occasionally we get a glimpse of what the world might look like from outside our own eyes by looking at ourselves and the world reflected in mirrors, or as seen in photos, on CCTV display monitors, or pre-recorded video footage. And a lot of people find these unfamiliar viewpoints uncomfortable in the sense that their perception of themselves often mismatches what they see in these simulated external viewpoints. Movies almost universally have us depart from reality by showing us a story seen through the shifting guise of an invisible observer whose viewpoint flips from one angle, time or place to another hundreds of times during the story. Only occasionally do we see events within a movie through the eyes of a character within that story. Usually it's very brief, and some movies have us see things through multiple characters' eyes, which again departs from reality. I don't think I've ever seen a feature movie that involves the audience viewing events only through the eyes of a single character. I'm sure it has been attempted though, and the fact that it hasn't caught on after over 100 years of cinema is a strong indication that people aren't seeking a movie experience that matches reality. They are happy to just be a fly on the wall whose viewpoints unrealistically chop and change to show the story in the most interesting and stimulating way. In the early days of video games, viewpoints were nearly always from the third person, the player looking at their game character externally as they controlled that same character's actions. And they loved it. Games like Pac-Man and Asteroids were huge hits, and today a good percentage of games are still played from completely unrealistic third-person perspectives, many simply adopting a sort of God's eye view of the action. The psychology of this is interesting because controlling a character while seeing them from outside the character's own viewpoint is sort of akin to being a military officer or commander issuing orders to troops, but never actually taking direct part in the battle themselves. Going back to the early video games, eventually we were able to play first-person perspective games, but the graphics left a lot to be desired. It took over 30 years and thousands of games to progress to today's near-photorealistic, by comparison, visuals, seen through the eyes of the player's character. Yet third-person gaming is still popular. I'd be interested to see some sort of experiment done to test whether gamers react with more emotional intensity depending on whether they're playing a game involving a first or third-person perspective. Games like Doom 3 and Alien Resurrection certainly gave me a few scares in the dark, but then so did Silent Hill and Resident Evil. And there are plenty of horror movies that scare the hell out of people with third-person perspective scenes. From what I can tell, audiences are equally capable of reacting to both.